Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on design controls, requirements for medical device developers. My name is Michael, and I'll be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of today's event. Today's webinar is being presented by Mr. John E. Lincoln. A few words about John. John is a medical device and regulatory affairs consultant. He's helped companies to implement or modify their GMP systems and procedures, product risk management, and US FDA responses. In addition, he's also successfully designed, written, and run all types of process equipment and software qualifications which have passed FDA audit or submission scrutiny and described in peer-reviewed technical articles and workshops worldwide. John has also managed pilot production, regulatory affairs, product development, design control, 510K submissions, risk management per ISO 14971, and projects with over 28 years of experience in the FDA-regulated medical products industry, working with startups to Fortune 100 companies, including Abbott Laboratories, Hospira, Tyco, and he's also a graduate of UCLA. We are honored to have John with us to present today's webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I just want to quickly outline today's program. This webinar is for a 90-minute duration. First, John will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that he would cover, and then share with you his presentation. And also, we want to inform all our participants that once part of today's teleconference, you've been placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begin towards the end of the webinar. Again, this is just to ensure that there is no discontinuity, and also to ensure that when John does present today's session, all of you could take maximum benefit from today's webinar. And if you do have questions during the session, what you could do is you could post your questions in the Q&A panel, which is on your participant screen, and we can come back to it during the Q&A session. And also, if you do come up with questions after the session as well, you could have them emailed to me directly or the Global Compliance Panel team, and we'll have them forwarded to John to get you an answer. And for any reason, ladies and gentlemen, if you do get logged out of today's session, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we're all set, I do request John to take it from here. John?
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you all for attending. For those of you that signed up for the this presentation in February, I apologize. I had bronchitis, and I appreciate you having patience in us rescheduling this webinar for today. I'd like to reemphasize the Q&A. I have a lot of slides. I don't cover all the material on all the slides. So if you feel that a point needs a little further clarification to your satisfaction, please jot that point down for Q&A at the conclusion, as well as if you had certain expectations for this webinar that you feel weren't addressed by me, please address that during the Q&A. And as Michael brought out, if you think of something later on, submit it to Global Compliance Panel. It will be sent to me. If it is of general interest, the question and answer will be disseminated to all you in attendance. And also that invitation extends far beyond the next couple of weeks. So if you think of something months later, please contact me through Global Compliance Panel or directly, and I will respond to your question if it's of a general nature or point you in the right direction. Of course, I am a consultant, so if you have specific issues, I'm more than happy to address that on a fee basis, but the invitation for general Q&A is no charge. It's one of the added benefits of this webinar. Now, design control, especially for developers, is a key issue with the FDA. For those of you that have been audited by the FDA, you know that device companies, medical device companies, are audited generally under the QSIT model, Quality System Inspection Technique. And that focuses on 7 areas of the GMPs and really drills down to 4 key areas. The 4 key areas are management responsibility, design control, as we'll be talking about here, CAPA, and production and process controls. And of course, they have linkages to other areas like process and production process controls can link to sterilization, etc. If you don't have a copy of QSIT, I'd certainly urge you to get a copy off the FDA's website, www.fda.gov. Type in QSIT and pull it up and keep it, because it explains not only the key audit areas, but the flow chart that the FDA uses in going through those key areas and how one can feed into the other, like CAPA can feed into production and process controls, etc. But again, the key point is that design control since 1996-97 has become a key area for FDA audit. And I'm going to stress not the FDA audit part of it, which is kind of a given, but the fact that design control makes sense from other standpoints. For those of you that have been in large companies for many years, you know that those large companies, if they wanted a consistent means of bringing new products to market, had methods that were defined by SOPs as to how to do that long before design control. But for those of you newer to the industry or in a startup company, design control is a quick and dirty way to do fast cycle development, have a template that is repeatable for new product development, and since sometimes R&D personnel and marketing personnel, and I also add programmers to this, tend to view themselves as creative types that view paperwork as somewhat stifling. For you that are involved in senior management and or in companies that hire individuals like that, recognize that this is a means to capture intellectual property rather than keeping in people's brains. It's a way to get it down on paper, to prevent reinventing the wheel, to allow training, to allow root cause analysis, etc. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this discussion. So I want to emphasize the fact that design control is required under 21 CFR 820.30, but we appreciate the fact that it makes sense to do it anyway. And some of the companies I worked for in the past did it that way. They may have called it project control. They may have called the resulting document a project history file as opposed to design history file, but it was a way to control changes. And that's what the FDA recognizes. That's one of the key purposes, because they recognize even in the design process, changes that are uncontrolled can lead to solving one problem but adding additional problems that may be unforeseen. Now, I want to talk about some of the key elements that you notice here on the agenda. And we already discussed a little bit about the business case for design control, that second to the last bullet point. But we'll appreciate the many different ways that we can utilize this. And again, bear in mind that the approaches I talk about do satisfy FDA GMP requirements. They do work in large companies and small companies, but you can come up with different varieties to meet the design control requirements, not just the approach that I'm giving here. Although, like Michael mentioned in the introduction, these methods that I talk about have indeed been run through the FDA ringer, if you will, during audits or submissions to the FDA. So they do have a certain amount of proven history. Now, as I mentioned, the United States Food and Drug Administration design control requirements are formulated in 21 CFR 820.30. This is since 1996-97. That's the time the FDA added this requirement to the GMPs for devices, and they gave industry about a year to come into compliance to it. So for those of you that have been in the business for a few years, this should certainly not be a surprise to you, although surprisingly, if you look at the 2012 483 summary on the FDA's website, you will find there are still companies that do not have a design control requirement in their own SOPs or their systems, and yet they manufacture products that require design control. So some of the points I may talk about are elemental, but sad to say, many companies are still not doing them, and it's still a source of 483 observations and warning letters. Now, this third bullet point down here mentions the fact that design control it has a good, strong business purpose. Those of you that may have read books on fast cycle development know they talk a lot about gating from one phase to the next. And of course, design control talks about gating in a sense, doesn't use that word, but the principles of reviews, the various elements of design control are gates, in effect, to the next element. And we'll see that with a slide I'll show a little later on. One of the key requirements of design control and its documentation is that you prove by your documentation that the design, the resulting product, if you will, meets the user requirements. And when we say user and use requirements, the FDA divides the two into the patient clinician and also the environment, the use environment, which can be very confusing if your product's designed to be used, say, in a trauma situation, in an ER or trauma unit. You have to consider the use environment, the confusing nature of that use environment in designing your product to be user-friendly and intuitive to some degree, not relying upon manuals or instructions that may not be there and or labeling that may not be readily apparent in a trauma situation. So that's an evident of some of the user requirements that may not be what marketing is telling you. In addition to that, there'd be standards to consider, guidance documents from the FDA that should definitely be considered. Your design control paperwork, documentation, if you will, has to show that your design input has in fact been met by the design output. And this is done by various verification steps that, again, we'll discuss and illustrate throughout this discussion. Now, the design history file output becomes the device master record input. So that's kind of a key deliverable of the design history file and the design control process. I'm sure many of you get involved in some of these forums on LinkedIn and elsewhere that deal with these issues. You notice there's all kinds of arguments about design control. They're all over the map. Some of them I totally disagree with. Others I recognize are just a different approach to solve the same thing, as I mentioned earlier. There's no one way to satisfy the FDA's requirement, and that's the way it should be. The FDA gives companies a certain amount of leeway to adapt their culture to the GMPs. As long as they meet the basic GMPs, there can be many different ways of doing that. And one of the things that will be a theme throughout this discussion is the fact that some companies choose to use design control throughout the entire life cycle of the product, from cradle to grave, so to speak. Others choose to use it just in the very beginning, the R&D to design transfer stage, and then they close it out to the device master record, et cetera, and change control under the overall company's GMP change control system. And we'll talk about that possibility a little later on as well. But now the design history file talks about the events over time in developing that product. In other words, the history of how the product got from a start date in R&D to where it is currently. Or generally to where it was in design transfer, depending on which of the two models you choose to use as a company. And then the design history file shows the proof of how design control requirements of 21 CFR 820.30 were in fact met by means of documentation. Excuse me. Now, we will talk a little bit about the difference between the FDA's GMP design control requirements and the European Union's design control under ISO 13485, the 9001 version for devices. The European Union's medical device directive technical file shows that that product has in fact met the essential requirements spelled out in the medical device directive and any applicable standards in the essential requirements. It also shows where the product is as a snapshot in time or point in time, as it is currently being marketed with the CE mark on it. So whenever you change your product, you have to upgrade your technical file / design dossier. That's different from the FDA's design history file, which shows the development history up to at least design transfer, if not all the way through to cradle to grave, so to speak. So there is a difference between technical file design dossier and the design history file, although the majority of the documentation will overlap. The design history file will in fact be larger in most cases with many more pointers to other documents like validation documents as opposed to a technical file design dossier. So again, to reiterate those two key differences, the design history file under the FDA's GMPs for devices shows the development history and the change control used to take that product through its various developmental stages once it was decided to be commercialized, once there was a company start date, if you will. And that's opposed to the Medical Device Directive's technical file design dossier, which shows the product as it is and the justification for it meeting its essential requirements under the Medical Device Directive at the time it's on the marketplace. So that's probably the key difference between these two systems, if you will. Now, obviously, some of you are aware of the fact that both the FDA and the European Union are trying to gradually move these models together. And some changes have to do with, we'll talk about that later, clinicals, as well as the developmental history maybe being included in a technical file more so than it is now, which is virtually not at all. So looking at the US FDA's GMPs for devices, 820 and .30 specifically, we see that design control, its requirements, its systems that it talks about, which we'll discuss in detail, inputs into the design history file in terms of documentation to prove that design control requirements were indeed met. The design history file includes the developmental history of the documentation that ultimately becomes part of the device master record, which would be your SOPs for assembly, SOPs for testing, drawings, schematics, production equipment that's unique to that piece of equipment, etc. And then, of course, the device master record, part of it includes a unfilled out template that is your traveler, usually your device history record, DHR, or batch record or lot record or serial number record that goes along with the product as it's being built to record lot numbers of raw materials, steps that were taken, QC that was performed, individuals that did it, times it was done, parameters set on various key pieces of equipment, etc. Now, this is kind of a poor copy of Kimberly Troutman's discussion years ago on design control, where she showed the overlap between research and development. You as a company are responsible to have a start date for design control. And everybody asks, well, what is that? And what does the FDA expect? The FDA expects you as a company to put in a date that's reasonable, a date that obviously doesn't show you're trying to escape the design control requirements. So it should be somewhere at the point where what I tell my clients, it should be at the point where the company decides they've got a blue sky product in R&D that they realize is commercial. And they themselves want to develop it for commercialization, or they themselves want to develop to a point where they can spin it off or sell it for commercialization. At that point where serious money's thrown at a product that was in R&D to develop it for the commercial market, that is probably the date for your start date for design control. The FDA expects you to define that as a company and then to follow that, your own definition in that. So according to Kimberly Troutman's slide, she showed it was somewhere between the research part and the development part, somewhere in that area where those two areas overlap in R&D. And like I say, it follows the fast cycle gating technique where serious money is really committed, budgeted for this product, is probably the good time to really start your design control procedures and documentation. Now in the design history file, the 820.30 requires about 9 items. 8 of them are shown here, 2 are combined. I apologize, I missed putting design output on this slide. But anyway, you have the design planning, and generally I use a Gantt chart to do that. Design input, spelling that out, your requirements, in other words, from which everything else follows. Your design changes throughout the entire process. Design reviews at periodic points throughout the entire process. The FDA does not specify a frequency of reviews, although even though they talk about basically one in the GMPs, you'll notice on a slide that they publish, they show several of them. And the design review has to include an independent reviewer, somebody who's capable to do a legitimate review on that phase that's under review, but does not have a vested interest in the outcome of the review. So maybe you have a program being developed. You could bring in a programmer that might be involved in another element in the same project, but not this particular phase that is being under review as part of your reviewer. In most cases, though, your independent reviewer is at least a QA RA individual, quality assurance, regulatory affairs person, preferably one that has expertise in this area. If they don't, are able to ask the right questions and or tap into that expertise either during the meeting or offline, so to speak. Design verification is another of the elements, and design validation is a second element, and we'll define those two by virtue of a slide I'll show later. And then design transfer leading to the design history file. Now, depending on how you define that determines how you go about either closing out your history file or keeping it open for the entire life of your product. I prefer closing it out at the point of design transfer, and then I prefer either reopening it, which I don't recommend, or adding addendums to it if there's major changes. If there's minor changes, just handle all of that under the change control, not the design change control system, but the change control system that is used throughout your company for GMP compliance. But again, that's my personal preference. That is the preference that I encourage companies that I work with as clients, or it's also as the system I have observed in some large companies that I've worked with in the past as well. But other methods will work, and if your culture is such that it's more adaptable to keeping the design history file open throughout and doing all your design changes under design control as opposed to your change control system in your company, that is up to you. But I find it confusing to toggle back and forth between a change control system geared to design as opposed to a change control system geared to everything else. If your company has a better way of doing that and can ease the confusion of such toggling, and that can be done and has been done successfully, then by all means follow that model instead of the one that you'll notice me tending to favor in this discussion. Now, the documents that are required in your design history file to prove design control are listed here, for example. In other words, taken from this one reference based on back in 1997 when the system was becoming required, the FDA said certain basic design information may be maintained in a single project file in a specified location. This may include the following: detailed design and development plan, which I mentioned I use a Gantt chart, which lists milestones, tasks, timelines, teams involved, and comments. Copies of improved design input documents and design output documents, and of course the verification between the two. Documentation of your design reviews, including team members, who the uninvolved third-party reviewer is, time and date, location held. Validation documentation, and we're talking about the overall validation of the entire product, plus maybe some process validation, etc. And again, I'll discuss a little bit more on that later. And then, of course, copies of controlled design documents and change control records, because that is one of the key purposes of the design control requirement, that you are controlling change in an environment and in the past did not want to or could conceive of the process of formal change control and approval in an R&D environment. Now, here's the breakdown of the design history file requirements. And basically what I've done is I've taken this from an SOP/attachment I developed back in the 80s expanded upon in the 90s with the development of design control to show how to bring a product to market for one company that I worked with. It's very abbreviated. The document I developed was about 8 pages long, but I've highlighted, added and highlighted and changed the terminology to fit with 820.30. And so as you'll notice in this element here, you'll see the first element is to have a plan. And the plan should actually define how you're developing this product. It may be a living document. I would urge you to consider it being a living document that is under change control and is changed or revved periodically. And I usually include all the revs in my design history file. That's me. It's up to you. But sometimes some of the changes on a plan are good to look at to point you in the right direction for the supporting documentation if you're trying to do some maybe root cause analysis of a failure downstream or some other issues that come up. Design inputs. These are the things, those of you that have been audited by the FDA know that whenever they look at any kind of validation documentation, they want to see what the requirements were, and then they want to see that your testing, your verification steps met or addressed every one of those requirements. So when you're talking about design control, you're talking about what are the design inputs, what are the issues you are trying to address in developing this new product or this major line extension of an existing product. So you'd certainly have product specs. Frequently that may be coming from marketing and enhanced by engineering terms added by engineering. Certainly it would include any applicable standards. More and more, this next bullet point brings out the fact that the FDA expects you to do an analysis, especially if you're changing a product. You've got a product under a 510K, Class 2 generally, product under the FDA's classification system, and you're making changes to it. Well, there comes a point in time where a lot of little changes cumulatively reach a tipping point where you need to file a new 510K, and we have webinars that deal with that subject. Or I recommend that in order to do that analysis, you go to the FDA's website, look for their K97-1 memo for changes. They had a draft guidance document out on changes, but they pulled that. But basically, the K97-1 gives the same kind of information. I usually make a matrix out of that K97-1, every single element on it, and then I go through for each time there's a major change as part of the change order. I go through and pull up one of these blank matrices and fill it out to determine whether or not I have to file a new 510K as a result of one major change or a series of minor changes cumulatively considered with each new minor change to determine when, in fact, my product has reached a point where safety and efficacy become an issue again and a new 510K has to be filed. There's another simple way to do that, and that is to take the K97 document verbatim, just print it out and annotate it manually and sign and date it. That's another way, but it doesn't fit in with electronic records if you're already under that kind of system. QC instructions, drawings, prototyping, SOPs, change history, etc. would be part of your documentation. Part of the many verifications leading to product validation would be bench testing for functional testing, lab test data, for example, maybe on material strength, material biocompatibility issues. If it's a sterile product, sterilization, or including a tier 28 analysis to show that your product is just as easily sterilized as existing products you've already validated for sterilization. Electromagnetic compatibility, packaging issues, aging, both accelerated aging and real-time shelf studies, etc., would be all part of the requirements. That should be added to your file, and they would be spelled out in your inputs, and the resulting documentation would be part of your outputs. And then you'd compare that you addressed all the inputs with your outputs and maybe document that either through some kind of narrative or a matrix. Risk analysis. More and more, since everything the FDA says is risk-based, especially software validation, but virtually everything, root cause analysis, failure investigations, etc., regular validations, you should have a product risk hazard analysis / risk management file and report. And I generally default to a ISO standard that the FDA recognizes, ISO 14971, which deals with devices, and all its appendices deal with devices and give you the questions to ask and compile as part of your fault tree analysis / failure mode and effect analysis. But I also use that model across the board in other industries as well, even though it is geared to devices. Design reviews, that you hold them periodically at key points or gates, if you will. Again, that's not stated in the GMPs, but it is illustrated on the FDA slide that we'll show in just a minute. But you notice here in this slide we've covered the first 3 of the 9 requirements of 820.30. And if you're developing these products, if you're in charge of development, you need to plan for addressing these right at the get-go, right at the start. Your plan should be at the start. You'll be enhancing it as you go along, and then that plan becomes a template for future developments in the future. But then you also should be compiling all of these as you go into a design history file, as opposed to waiting at the end and trying to pull it all together after the fact, which becomes very painful, time-consuming, and frequently, as a result, many things are left out or dropped. But by doing this up front, you make sure each element is addressed when it needs to be addressed. Design output, that results ultimately in your device master record, but it also results in the other things that are required, such as training, etc., which would include defect recognition. The FDA more and more looks for that. Certainly a device master record would include your final manufacturing and test SOPs, your preventive maintenance, calibration requirements for either the product or the manufacturing process to get the product, your device history record formats, in other words, the batch lot record traveler, if you will, and then design verification. These are the various, I use the term verification in the terms of inspection, test, checklists, etc. So here again, you're making sure that every design input requirement has been met by a document, a design output document, and or testing, whatever is necessary to prove that your inputs have been addressed. Now, you may find in the course of doing this, and you will, that you're bouncing back and forth between the two, and as a result of that, sometimes you have to modify your inputs. Some things aren't doable at this point, or your company does not have the expertise, nor does it want to outsource that expertise, and so you make some design arounds, if you will, to still get the product to pretty much meet the requirements, but maybe it misses something. However, whenever you do that, recognize the FDA is going to dig into that and see why you did it and what your rationale was, and whether you effectively addressed everything by making that workaround or design around. Design validation, that's the sum total of all the verification steps. And again, we'll see that by means of this chart that's mentioned here, and I have a slide of in a minute. Now, design validation includes the production environment as well. So you're getting into not only product validation, but the process validation, which gets into design qualification or specs, the requirement specs, your installation qualification, the operation qualification, your performance and process qualifications. And those are more than one. They're usually 3 or more, depending on the amount of effort necessary to address all the worst case inputs. Design transfer, here's where in the old days we used to use the term throw it over the wall. R&D would throw it over to production. Manufacturing engineering would take over. But more and more companies now recognize the fallacy of doing that literally, so the design transfer is actually a kind of a formal review of documentation, the assurance that all the necessary documents are online, ready to go in their final format, signed off, approved, and on the system. Your design transfer shouldn't be a surprise to anybody because you develop this product hopefully with production and QA and other stakeholders involved from the very beginning as part of the development team. hopefully that's what your company does. And then, of course, all of this, any changes, any modifications, any developmental history is all under design change control. Most companies that are large have their own prototype change control system separate from their GMP compliance change control system. And until the point of design transfer, all these changes are done under their prototype change control system. Now that generally basically means that, because R&D, you can imagine they're tending to throw up over this entire concept. It basically means that whenever you make a change to the design that you've generally accepted as being the product's design, and now you start having problems with some areas, maybe the type of material, type of bonding agent, etc., that you recognize you have to make some changes, those changes are signed off by more than one person. They're approved, if you will, and that's documented. So you have a change history throughout. Of course, in your design history file, you'd certainly have pilot production data. I like to include either references to or copies of lab books regarding some of the initial bench testing and some of the extra things that were a major step in getting the product to where it finally is. And then the final design review, first lot to stock for those companies that utilize that principle, QA, QC, and the design history file completion for the first build going to the marketplace. And all of this becomes part of the design history file. Now here's the slide I was referring to. The FDA, I believe, borrowed this from Canada, but nevertheless, it's an excellent illustration of the principle regarding product verification and product validation. Those of you that look at those terms under ISO and GMPs know that they have different meanings under different schemes, like process validation means a different thing. And also the subtle wording differences between those two definitions can be somewhat confusing. But this slide, at least as far as what we're talking about, product validation is very vivid, if you will. It shows a nice orderly process, which we know is not literally that orderly. It shows arrows moving from an upper left position to a lower right position. In reality, you'd be bouncing back and forth a lot in the development process. However, that bouncing back and forth would be controlled under change control once you've established your start date. So anyway, you have your user needs, which, as I mentioned, include the use environment, include the standards and guidance documents that would be applicable, such as ground fault, EMC, whatever, if you have electrical issues, etc. So it's not just what the customer wants, it's also what you need to meet as in standards. If you're CE marking your product for overseas, then you have specific standards that are called out. If you're getting a 510K through domestic, then you also have additional guidance documents and standards that have to be met, frequently the same ones. But nevertheless, those are the needs that have been listed in the requirements for that product. The design input then breaks those down into specifics, such as the actual drawings you might need, schematics, algorithms if you have computer programs involved, etc. And then the design process, getting from the input to the resulting output. So this goes through many different iterations, back and forth. You may come up with a product that is similar to what's out there. You've done some reverse engineering. You know essentially what you're going to be doing. But as you get into it, given your own company and your own desire to make some changes, you run into some problems, so you bounce back and forth until you get it ironed out. And all of this, of course, as I mentioned, is documented. But as you eliminate one of these elements, as you move down the line, if you will, you should have a gated release to the next stage under a design review with that disinterested third party as part of it. Verification then would be maybe comparing documentation to ensure that you've met all the requirements, and that would be verified by a document of some kind, an electronic record or a manual record, signed and dated. It may include various tests, as we'll mention in just a little bit later, all of which to prove that you've met your input requirements by the resulting output. And some of that testing would be biocompatibility testing, etc. Whatever is required in order to market your product in a safe and effective manner. And then the ultimate result is compiling all these verification documents, etc., into a package that becomes part of the validation that your anticipated product has been met by the resulting product, as spelled out in user needs and the resulting physical product, both the test data on the physical product and the review of the documentation that defines that product, the device master record, if you will. This becomes the product validation, which is part of the design history file. The design history file may point to this as a separate document with its own number, probably held in the document control, or it may include copies of that in the design history file. It's a device history file, design history file, excuse me. That is up to you as a company to define how you're going to do that. Certainly, if it's a super large document, you'd probably want to have a pointer in the design history file to that document as opposed to including a copy of it in the design history file. But again, you have to determine in your company how you archive documentation. If you, after a set period of time, ship off some of this documentation to some mountain and have it locked in a vault, then you may not be able to access it readily when questions come up. CAPA, root cause analysis requirements require it, or when the FDA audits it. So if that's the case, you may want to include a copy of it in your design history file, even though that may expand its size exponentially. Same with validation documentation, different from what we're talking about here, validation of the process, for example, to build the product or test it. Some of the examples of product verification would be, first of all, your ISO document 14971 for product hazard analysis, biocompatibility testing if your product comes in contact with human tissue or fluids, such as cytotox, hemolysis, irritation, sensitization, and whether it's cancer-causing. Functional testing to make sure the product, in fact, works the way it's supposed to work, is user-friendly, etc. Software and firmware testing if it's appropriate. And again, I follow the model, the 11-element model that the FDA has published under its document of 510K submissions containing software. I use it for all software validation. And those 11 elements are a software validation documentation package within the overall product validation package. Accelerated aging. Now, if you're filing a 510K, you will not have the real-time aging, but you will have accelerated aging data to show that you can at least theoretically, based on standard test procedures, meet the shelf life requirements that you put on your expiration dating. But then the FDA expects you to verify that accelerated aging by means of real-time aging studies. So if you're claiming a 3-year shelf life, you should be pulling enough samples that you can check the sterility, if it's a sterile product, and the functionality of that product over its life, maybe each year, testing it up through the 3 or 5 year shelf life claimed. Shake and drop testing for packaging viability, as well as maybe real-time shipping across country or across the world, however you do that. Product bioburden issues, LAL, pyrogenicity testing, if you make that claim, particulate testing, if that's a requirement, if it's in the fluid pathway, sterilization issues, and if you have a 510K for ETO sterilized product, you have to do residual testing and put the actual residual data in your submission, gamma, etc. All of this either validated or included under a AMI Tier 28 analysis to show that your product is better than the worst case product that you have as an example that you validated for sterilization. Any other testing that would be appropriate for that product or required under guidance documents or standards, all of this would become a part of your various verification steps that become part of the product validation and a subpart of the design history file. Now, obviously, in addition to the product itself, you have your manufacturing process. Now, if you're just developing this on the same production line as other things, you may have some minor changes to parameters, etc., which would have their own verification and or validation, or more than likely you're developing a whole new production line, in which case you've got process/equipment, production equipment to be testing, validating, as well as test equipment testing and procedures to be tested. Now, when I do a validation document, I start out with a purpose, introduction purpose. I reference the risk document because I'm going to have this a risk-based document in terms of how far I drill down on various issues. There will be a protocol defining how the test is actually carried out, along with predetermined acceptance criteria. That's a big issue with the FDA. And so, again, this presentation is geared to developers, but if you're developing product, you need to be aware of these softer areas as well, not just developing the product itself, but bearing in mind some of the documentation issues that have to be met, and that sometimes can affect the pathway in which your development process takes. The design qualification, I generally define that as a requirements listing. So software requirements, product requirements, process requirements, etc., which drive the purchase specs for anything that's commercially purchased or outsourced. Installation qualification, now to me that's a verification step. Now incidentally, you'll notice we're talking about verification, validation, qualification. If you look on the web, you'll find all kinds of arguments for the definition of all of those. They're somewhat vague when you look at the ISO and GMPs. I would disagree with anybody that says they're clear, because to me they are not. I mean, sure, you can split hairs and you can define the slight difference in wording between a verification and a validation under ISO and the GMPs, but why not take those documents and definitions and write them in your own words for your company? And I've never seen any auditor take issue with that if it falls within the broad definition under ISO or the GMPs. And I recommend every company do that. So to me, a design qualification most of the time is a requirements spec. The installation qualification to me is a checklist to verify all the things required to make sure that that piece of equipment or process has been properly installed. Let's say it's a injection molding piece of equipment. You have to have the floor prepared for the weight and vibration and leveled, etc. You have to make sure that it has grounding, that it has the right phase and voltage of electricity and amperage, that there are safety issues. Although the FDA is less concerned with safety, certainly you got OSHA issues, and why not include that as part of your installation qualification? I usually include light curtain issues or sensors as part of that IQ. Operational qualification, to me, this is a point where you optimize or establish your parameters. I use, in some cases, a design of experiments to do that. Many companies just take what the sales rep gives them or what they've used on similar pieces of equipment. I've seen that even on some of the forums, even for validation. We don't need to validate it's the same equipment as the previous one we bought. I would totally disagree with that. You may reduce it, but there's no such thing as two identical pieces of equipment, even if they're the next serial number off the production line from the manufacturer supplying that equipment. So it's up to you to determine what the issues are based on risk, and then provide the documentation to show that those have been fully addressed. But anyway, the OQ proves that everything has been optimized. And so you've established your nominal operating tolerances and the range, the high and low range. And then you run your process over a lengthy period of time to show perhaps that at nominal, at high, at low, at some combination, that everything works. During many shifts, if you have 3 shifts or 2, that you've run at least through each of those shifts. If you have huge incoming raw materials like silo loads of resin or APIs, that you run them through more than one silo load. Now that may take quite a while, in which case I recommend you run at least 3 PQ runs with the one silo, and then add another PQ run with the next silo and a maybe a fifth PQ run with the next silo to show that all your worst case inputs have in fact been addressed. I say that for several reasons. I personally have seen problems where that's been circumvented, and if you read recalls and read between the lines, you can sometimes see that some of the recalls were a result of validations not including all the worst case issues. And then of course results, which to me is the raw data, and then the conclusions, which is an analysis of the raw data coming up to the conclusion that your predetermined acceptance criteria have in fact been met, or where there were problems that you show how you've addressed that and retested to address that change in order to show that you now meet your modified requirements. All of this, too, would be included in your design history file or as pointers in your design history file to the other documentations or documents that exist, the other validation files, etc. Now, we already talked about these 9 issues, but again, I just want to reiterate some of these. With the first one, I use a Gantt chart, and I develop it just on Word or Excel, but you can buy Microsoft Project or something similar. But to me, it's easier just to go with something that I can quickly be familiar with without having to relearn the application, because I'm not a project manager as a profession. For those of you that are, you can use a dedicated project management software to do that. Make sure that you have a start date that's defined by your company in an SOP and that you follow that. And then, of course, your design inputs. Now, in previous discussions similar to this, I've had challenges in question and answer regarding why you included something under design input versus design output. Bear in mind, the requirements are the basic initial starting requirements, and they may be the initial specs and the initial draft documents. Or you can put some of those under design output, but ultimately the design output would be the close to finalized documents, which would be fully finalized under design transfer. It's up to you to define how you do that. Your SOP can either spell that out or leave it a little bit vague, and as long as you include it all somewhere in those areas, and it makes sense that somebody else can follow it that's not familiar with the process that was actually done and explain it or audit it, then you're okay, providing it's in harmony with your SOP. The design reviews, as we mentioned earlier, to me this makes sense even if you didn't adhere to the GMPs because of dating, allowing analysis of the project to date, and then any subsequent corrections, modifications, changes before moving it to the next level, so to speak. And then, of course, the design verification. Again, that's a series of inspections, tests, checklists, etc. Matrix, if you will. Design validation, we talked about that earlier with that slide from the FDA. But again, that's a series of verification steps showing that you've proven that your design input or your product as originally anticipated has been resulting in a production prototype that meets that intended design or requirement. The design transfer is the fact of getting all this documentation into the system to drive your production, to drive your ordering, to drive your testing, etc. In fact, basically it's all your device master record documentation, SOPs, training of the SOPs, the bill of materials, the traveler, all those things that would be part of defining how you build the product, the drawings, the SOPs for production, for testing, etc. And then all of this, any changes throughout this entire process from the start date are under an approval sign-off system, resulting in a design history file that covers all these points with documentation or with pointers to where the documentation resides. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key deliverables from the design history file, which is a documentation of the design control process, is the device master record. The device master record is all the records that define your product. Some companies have a chart, if you will, or a document that lists all those with the pointers to the actual documents by document number, rev number. Others may have a more generalized document that says this is what has to be part of that element as spelled out on a bill of materials, etc. It's up to you as a company to define how you address the DMR issue itself. But anyway, it is the sum total of all the documentation, either e-documentation or manual documentation, that defines how your product comes to be a product in terms of that lot that's built. So this is the basis for defining your lot records, if you will, and as I mentioned earlier. So device master record, one of its documents would be a template for a unfilled out traveler, an unfilled out bill of material, etc., that is filled out each time that lot goes through, listing the lot numbers, quantities, test results, etc. The device master record also should require a requirement, as that last bullet point brings out, for CAPA. You should have, if not a specific SOP for this particular product, at least verify that there is an existing SOP for post-market surveillance. Now, true, post-market surveillance by the FDA is generally limited to implantables, but in reality, that general principle applies across the board under your corrective and preventive action system. You're monitoring how your product's doing out in the field. You're making changes where necessary under change control or under the design control, whichever approach you take, and you're continually improving your product. If you look at the FDA's website, if you're in devices, you're maybe looking at some of the Q documents for pharmaceuticals and vice versa, you will find more and more the term life cycle and the concern from cradle to grave that you continue to revalidate as necessary, a regression test, whatever you need to do to verify, not just once you transfer the product to production, but from then on, that you ensure your product is the best it can be and that serious problems are addressed by design changes, etc., to eliminate those problems or greatly reduce their impact upon the using public. Device history record, which is the lot or batch record, the DHR. Again, that would be the deliverable defined by, or the key deliverable defined by the device master record. It would either include or reference the bill of material. It would be certainly part of the traveler that follows along physically or on a computer with the production of that particular lot of product. And that lot could be a lot of one if you're building huge capital equipment items like MRIs, or it can be lots of tens of thousands if you're building small disposables. So nevertheless, these are all part of the device history record. When it's filled out, it becomes the lot record for that product. And also, if it's sterile and you group several lots of raw material or products into a sterile load, then the sterile load would be part of the device history record, even though it might be a covering document having several batches in it. Certainly you would reference the sterile load number in your traveler for that particular batch. And then maybe have a separate file for that sterile load that shows the result of the test for sterility, et cetera, and the processes, parameters that were met that had been validated, whether you're using gamma or ETO or whatever. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This should be something very familiar to the majority of those in the audience, unless you're in R&D, in which case be aware of them, and maybe when you get back to your company, look and see how they are handling your company. And again, see what kind of information is in there, because it may affect your way of going about your R&D activities as well. The high-risk areas. Now, the FDA has an area on its website. It's the 2012, I just punch in 2012 483s, and you get a whole analysis of all the areas, biologics, devices, pharmaceuticals, and the 483 observations that the FDA rendered in the quantity by totals, as well as the individual category and individual specific violation. It's a very useful thing to look at. Now, there's companies that sell that information or massage it and sell it, but you can go right to the FDA, right to the horse's mouth, if you will, pull up that document and look through it. I don't know, it's 30 or 70 pages long, I forget, but it covers all the 483 areas, and you'll notice a lot of repetition under design control and SOPs and similar. So it's a good clue to find out what the real high-risk areas. But in addition to that, some of the key areas that I found in the past, of course, one of the most obvious gimme to the FDA is you don't have a design control system in operation. It's not defined by SOP. You're not following your SOP. You don't have a start date. You don't have other issues that are addressed. Now, that middle bullet point is interesting. SOPs must be followed, otherwise adulterated. I'm amazed at how many big companies have tried to fight the FDA on this. Their product is safe, it's effective, it works, the buying public likes it, and yet the FDA says it's adulterated. And the reason why? Because the company cannot show by its documentation that they followed their own SOPs and other documents. And this is serious because without following your own SOPs, the FDA has no way to know at any point in time how you built that product. They have no assurance that you use the right chemicals, if you will, the right products, the right manufacturing materials, the right parameters. They have no assurance of anything. So your product is, in effect, adulterated. And no matter how you want to argue this, and some companies have argued it in court, they've actually, in some cases, won the court case, but they've lost in the marketplace. Because this drug out for many years, their product was off the market, or maybe just limited to emergency cases, and their stock fell, their reputation fell, their competitors jumped all over it, and we were happy to explain that to the buying public, and on and on and on. So make sure that you have the SOPs addressing all your GMPs and that you, in fact, follow those SOPs. And for those of you in development, R&D, make sure that your design control SOPs are followed. Now, if some of it seems to be purely bureaucratic or waste or doesn't make sense or doesn't follow the normal cycle, get it changed. If your way of doing things is a better way, get the SOP changed to allow that, as long as it fits in with the GMPs. And that's what I generally argue. Most companies have a de facto system to do something, and it's best that your SOPs capture the de facto system as opposed to impose a totally new system, providing the de facto system meets GMP requirements. Now, one of the big issues, well, FDA is always big on software, and more their local auditors are comfortable with software now, the younger generation, if you will. And I can say that because I'm of the older generation. Most of us are not that comfortable with software. I tend to be, but a lot of are not. Suppliers, the big issue with outsourcing, now again, you look on the FDA, on the various forms, find arguments between outsourcing and contract suppliers. I generally feel that anything that's been pushed outside the company, whether it could be done in-house or not, is outsourcing. But however you define that, make sure you define it in your SOPs. But bear in mind, the FDA is looking at contract suppliers / outsourcing, recognizing it's growing. They've increased their presence worldwide to address this. They've got 3 posts in mainland China, as well as in Asia and elsewhere in Africa, in order to do that with their own people, as opposed to contracting that out. And one of the key, or 2 of the key areas they're really interested in are certificates of analysis and certificates of compliance. So if you as an R&D developer of your product are going to be outsourcing key components, you need to recognize that you may be accepting those in, and your QA people will be taking that and developing the documentation to do this based on acceptable COAs, certificates of analysis, and certificates of compliance. The FDA knows this, so they want to know what's behind the numbers on those COAs, COCs. Do you know what that equipment is? Do you know if it's been validated? Do you know if it's calibrated? Do you know if the people are trained? Do you know if it's defined by an SOP? And if it's a critical element and you're accepting it on one of those certificates, you probably need to do a site audit or contract for a site audit to make sure that the documentation means what it says and it hasn't been just pencil whipped. Increasingly, the FDA is starting to look at validation to make sure that not only have your requirements been addressed in your test protocols and test cases, but that the data or metrics that you've chosen are the legitimate ones. Even your DOEs can be compromised if you've selected the wrong parameters to measure or control. So again, it's amazing how a very scientific process like statistical process control, design of experiments can be totally undercut by a very unsophisticated, unscientific method of selecting data and metrics. And for those of you that like to read other industry requirements, such as the ICH-Q series for pharmaceuticals, you will notice more and more the FDA is really stressing the understanding of the science behind your process, your quality attributes, your design space, and things like that, which I urge you in devices to be familiar with and incorporate those principles in your own operation. More and more I notice auditors asking for justification for validation sample sizes. I frequently default to N equals 30. And if you look on the web and you punch in Google search on N equals 30, you'll find all kinds of discussions all over the chart that really say nothing. There are a few good references out there, and the one I like to go to is Duran and Gurna's Quality Planning and Analysis, and you get several editions used off of Amazon or elsewhere. And I quote directly from a page that talks about N equal 30. And I cite that particular book as my justification, and I include that justification in the validation documentation if I'm using N equals 30. Treatment of outliers. In the past, there was a tendency to blow them off. If you had one data point way out there and the rest in a normal distribution, there's a tendency to dismiss it as an aberration. Well, the FDA has recognized that that is telling you something, and you have to at least analyze it and discuss it. And you may be able to, in a sense, buy it off, so to speak, in your discussion, and that may be acceptable. However, bear in mind that you want to monitor for that, because it's possible that outlier is telling you something that may infrequently occur and may result in some CAPA issues and maybe even a recall. So you certainly want to monitor it and make sure that your understanding of what caused that is in fact the correct understanding in a root cause. Now also another key area is the recognition, and this boils down to what we talked about earlier, that the FDA product classifications like 1, 2, and 3 are different from the European Union's classifications 1, 2A, 2B, and 3, not just in the numbering, but most importantly, the FDA, if you want to classify your product, you're told by law how to do it. You have to go to 21 CFR 800 and pick up your product under there, and it'll give you the product code and the registration number for your type of product. It'll tell you what classification it is and what the FDA's expectation for documentation for it is and systems. The European Union, on the other hand, does not define the classification of each product by law. It defines based on risk under Annex 9 rules, the rules as to how long it's indwelling, whether it is indwelling in the human body, et cetera, and determining classification. So you go through as a manufacturer, you come up with a rough idea, you talk to your notified body, and between the two of you, you determine what the classification of that product is, and that's what it is. And then, of course, if the medical device directive changes, like it did a few years ago with Mod 5, then you have to reclassify your product and fill out a new technical file design dossier. But with the FDA, it's all defined by law. If it's not classified, you have to talk to them. If it's not classified, more than likely you may have a PMA product where you have to do a long, involved, expensive process to get it to market with a lot of clinicals, not just a small amount. Just be aware of that difference. And again, if you're in R&D, you need to be aware of this as well. Slight differences can result in a classification change and a resulting cost-time element. Now, I mentioned earlier the medical device directives. I'm just going to skim through this because that's not the real purpose of this discussion, but be aware of it. Now, the bottom bullet points there, technical file, generally, from what I've seen from most notified bodies, they use that term for Class 1 and 2A and B. And design dossier, basically the same file of documents, they list as a Class 3. Now, ISO 13485 does require design control. This is under 7.1, planning of product realization. And so much of the same is required, except as I mentioned, the resulting documentation under the ISO 13485 medical device directive expectation is that it's a snapshot in time, although they are looking at changing that to having more development history in it, to make it more like a design history file. But as I mentioned earlier, that's a key issue, a key difference. You will notice a lot of the other elements of design control under ISO are very similar to 820.30 in terms of expectation for planning, for inputs, for outputs, determining that they match, for reviews, for verification, for validation, and for control. Now, what you include in your technical file, again, this is spelled out in the Medical Device Directive, Annex, as I mentioned here, 7, and your declaration of conformity, which if it's a Class 1, you can do yourself. If it's a Class 2 on, you do it in harmony with your notified body, who reviews it and audits it. They audit your quality management system, which is a given. Under 13485, you have to have that. And then they audit your technical file or design dossier, usually a desk audit, to make sure that not only do you have the quality management system functioning, but you meet the specific requirements of that type of product. And those two things then allow you to put a CE mark on your product and sell it outside the United States. Or inside too, for that matter, but the FDA could care less about a CE mark. The technical file, I list 13 elements. That may vary depending on your notified body, but basically you have a description of your product, a determination of its classification based on Annex 9 and whatever rule applies, and then that you've met the essential requirements. I usually use a matrix to cover all of them and NA those that are not appropriate, and that's Annex 1 of your Medical Device Directive. A product risk analysis, and that's ISO 14971. Sampling of your labeling. The FDA defines labeling as everything that promotes your product. It can be instructions, it can be warning labels, it can be labels on the product, labels on the boxes, it can be your website, it can be your marketing literature, all of that. And we've heard recently how one state court struck down the FDA's off-label use of product. But if you look at the FDA's website, and most of us as consumers of medical products wouldn't want this changed anyway, you'll find that the FDA is still adhering to their requirement that you do not market your product for off-label use, for uses that have not been spelled out in your clearance documentation, like your 510K under intended use, indications for use. Product specs, design control, again, as we mentioned under 7.1, etc., in the Medical Device Directive / ISO 13485. And then clinical evaluations. Here's where the FDA is slowly moving toward the European model. Under the European model, your clinical evaluation can basically be a literature review. If your product is somewhat of a Me Too product, there's a lot of history out there already published by doctors and researchers regarding your product and its interaction with a patient. You can include that data in your technical file in lieu of actually running clinicals. And the FDA is looking at that more and more. You'll notice that the new 510K allows for submission of literature regarding clinicals. And if it's sufficient and detailed enough and addresses specific issues of your product, they will accept that in lieu of clinicals. System test reports. Now you notice I have sterilization under there, but you may include it under sterilization number 12. It's up to you. But again, packaging, manufacturing, and your conclusions. And then you include your declaration of conformity. Usually that's on the front of it, the appendix in the back, and then a list of changes. Each time you make a change to your product, you have to come up with a new technical file. It has to be re-audited by your notified body. And usually most companies list those changes in the front of their technical file. Again, we've pretty well talked about the design dossier technical file. For essential requirements, I generally do a matrix here where I include every single requirement. I NA those that are not applicable. and then I indicate those that are regarding what standard applied, how we proved that we met that standard, and then initial the date to show it's been fulfilled. That's just one example. Here's just a sample of a declaration of conformity. This slide and the last slide should be done in concert with your own notified body. Whoever you're using as a notified body, work with them to come up with the format they prefer to use, because they're the ones that are going to be auditing you and defining it. And generally, in difference from the FDA, you're paying your notified body. They've got two arms. They've got the arm that helps you comply, and then they've got the arm that audits you. Well, the arm that helps you comply, that's what you're paying them to do, to help you to meet the requirements to get the CE mark on your product to sell it in Europe and some other countries that accept the CE mark. So again, you're working with them as a partner. With the FDA, it's totally different. It's somewhat adversarial. Sometimes an auditor will tell you what they think you should do to comply, but in most cases they're a little out of line when they do that. It's up to you to make that determination, and they will tell you whether you have or have not met the requirements after you've made your choice. You can get some assistance from them, but again, sometimes the advice you get under the small business arm or others can be shot down during an actual review of what you come up with. And they won't commit themselves, and it's understandable to some degree, until they actually see what you've done. And what you've done you may thought was a good faith attempt to follow what they told you should do, but in some cases they may find it's deficient, even after going through that exercise. Notified body high-risk areas, again, some of the issues regarding manufacturing and recognizing that a manufacturing audit of your quality management system is separate from a technical file or design dossier audit. The classification differences between the FDA and the European Union and the Medical Device Directive, not assuming that they're both the same. And just a few other points. Here's an example of the type of Gantt chart I mean as a project plan. And this is kind of a small project, but you just expand it as you get into the project. That assures you don't let things fall through the cracks. It meets the definition of plan. I've noticed, again, all kinds of arguments on the internet regarding what a plan is, but this is one approach, and it certainly has been accepted by the FDA as a legitimate response to what they require in a plan. Of course, you can meet it any number of ways, but even though you have a generic plan, you need to make it specific for that project as well. Again, the similarities between the FDA and the European Union deal with these issues that we've already pretty well covered. And then the risk management model, again, as I mentioned earlier, I use 14971 as a model. I include a fault-free analysis and at least 3 failure mode and effect analysis, criticality being because I still use the risk priority numbering system. You don't have to, but I still find it usable, and I use it as a means to justify how far I drill down on validations and failure investigations, etc. Anyway, your failure mode, maybe a FEMA or FEMECA. Generally, you have one for design, one for the process for manufacturing, and one for the use of it. Although all of them ultimately should drill down in terms of severity to the severity of failure upon the user, whether it be the patient or the clinician. Now, for design history file, generally the project team will supply the documentation and a lot of the information, but usually a project leader or individual designated by that project leader would do the compiling of it. It's generally more of a one-person job to compile, but the preparation of the documentation obviously is part of an entire team effort. A technical file design dossier, generally that's often compiled by one person. Generally it'd be reviewed by a team and signed by a high official in the company. Again, development of the design history file, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I would recommend that you do it ongoing, as I've emboldened here, that you don't try to do it after the fact, that you get the tabs formulated, get the binders, or if you're doing it electronically, get the file set up, and then add to it as you go along. Now, I mentioned a design history file. I'll give an example. It may be several volumes, 2 inches thick. I've had several that were almost like an old encyclopedia. Most I've seen are a lot smaller than that. A technical file is usually only 2 inches thick or so, plus or minus. So it's a lot different. Again, it depends on how easy it is to extract archived files. So that's a point to keep in mind. That middle bullet point we already talked about. If you're going to get CE marking, you have to have a technical file design dossier, but you obviously have to have a quality management system in existence prior to that. That's an assumption, and if you're dealing with a notified body for Class 2A, B, and 3, then you will be audited to having such a system in place before they'll even consider auditing your technical file design dossier. Now, the design transfer, we pretty well talked about that, but we remember the issues that I mentioned earlier. So how do you define design transfer versus closing out the design history file or not closing out the design history file? Certainly, you want to determine, do I want to handle changes to the design under my GMP change control system and close out my design history file, or do I want to keep the design history file open and add design changes to it and not use the formal change control system of the GMP system? Or do I want to have a system between the two where I may close the file out and for minor changes to process and design, I handle it under change control, but for major changes, add an appendix or addendum to my design history file for that and start from scratch, so to speak, making it a mini design control project that I use as an addendum to it. There's any of those approaches would work depending on how your company is already set up or what you plan to do, looking at both the positives and the downsides, because each system has its good and bad points. And any have been accepted by the FDA, providing they're defined in SOP and you follow your SOP. Can't stress that enough. Design transfer in the European Union, you handle your design changes under design control, and then you change your technical file design dossier to reflect the new changed product, and you have that re-audited by your notified body. And of course, all of that defined under the SOP. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the FDA will look for design control by looking at your design history file. Under QSIP, they will take your most high-risk product, the one that has the highest risk to the patient population, and the first time they audit your company, they will audit that one product. The next time, they will take the next highest risk product and audit it against the QSIP model, which I mentioned earlier and which I urge you to download if you haven't done so on the FDA's website, and so on. If you're doing internal auditing, you should audit all of your products and all of your systems each year, annually, and maybe subparts every 12th of the year, each month, if you will. I mentioned the classification, the differences between there. The FDA determines that, and they will check your product code, which is 3 alpha characters that have no bearing. They're arbitrary. Somebody told me at the FDA one time that they were initials of the original reviewers. I don't know if that's true, but nevertheless, they have no bearing in, to the product under which the product code covers. But then the registration does, in fact, the regulation number, excuse me. That's like 8 dash dot and then 4 digits after that. They're defined in the 21 CFR 800 series, and you have to pull out the one that most applies. If there's nothing that applies, then more than likely you have a PMA product that will have to be classified by the FDA. We pretty well talked about notified body audits, and again, they're a working relationship between you and the contracted notified body that you have. The design history file depends on how you define it as to whether it stays a living document or whether it's closed out. The technical file is, in fact, a living document. And the bottom point is a key point, I feel. These documents can be useful as training tools because they and the risk documents provide a really good description of how the product got where it is, what the issues are, etc. And certainly people that are involved in CAPA, root cause analysis, new product development should be familiar with the older documentation that exists. I also want to urge you to consider that when you look at 483s or have looked at your own 483s in your company, you will find sometimes that the FDA has written you up for something you know you do. And the problem was not that you didn't do it, but that the documentation was so unclear that you couldn't prove you did it to another party, or your own person that was following along with the FDA couldn't explain it satisfactorily because the people that actually did it are no longer with the company, and the explanation or the documentation is not that clear looking at it months later. I've seen situations where the FDA's taken documentation to the people that signed it, and the people that signed it could not explain the document. Now that is extremely embarrassing and often will ultimately drive a warning letter if it's a serious enough problem. So make sure that your documentation stands review years later by a person totally unfamiliar with the activities that took place there, but by looking at the documentation and given the requisite training that they should have to fill that job slot they have, can fully explain it, either to an auditor or, sad to say, sometimes in a court of law. We already talked about the movements toward harmonization, that the European Union is trying to move toward a little bit toward the design history file in terms of showing more of the development of history of the product, and the clinical data requirement that the FDA used to require just purely new clinicals with human trials, and now they're accepting more and more in a 510K where safety, efficacy, and similarity warranted clinical data from previous similar type family of products. I've talked about the business case for design control, recognizing that this is probably how you want to sell it to your senior management. Sure, you have to do it, but that's the lousiest way to sell something, a negative incentive, if you will. I recommend showing the business success reasons, the financial savings, the reproducibility and repeatability of your system, the better time control of your project by means of a repeatable system, the gating, if you will, fast cycle development, etc. And I've proven this myself, and I feel it's a major selling point to your senior management to give credibility to you in QA, if that's where you're from, or RA, and also for design control itself. That concludes my portion of this discussion. What I'd like to do now is ask Michael to open up the Q&A. Michael?
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, like John just said, we'll go ahead with the Q&A session now. So if you have any questions on today's topic, this would be your time. What you could do is, if you want to post a question verbally directly to John, you could go ahead and click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon on your participant screen. And that way I can go ahead and unmute your line and you can directly post your questions to John. Or, like I said earlier, you could at any time go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A panel as well, and that way John can look at the question, read them out loud, and then give you an answer. Or if you're unable to do either of the two, you could always send me a chat message with your questions, and I'll have them forwarded to John. So if you have any questions, ladies and gentlemen, please do go ahead.
Again, I urge you to look at what's out there. If you're new to this or setting up something new in your company, look at the discussion panels on LinkedIn, for example, under the appropriate areas or elsewhere. See what the key issues are among some of these individuals and then resolve those in your company, frequently by taking definitions that exist and expanding them to, as long as they're still within the overall definition, expanding them to the terminology and the culture within your own company.
And ladies and gentlemen, I also want to keep you informed that if you do come up with questions after the session as well, you could have them emailed directly to me or the Global Compliance Panel team, and we'll have them forward to John to get you an answer. And also want to let you know that today's webinar is also available in a recorded format. So if you feel that yourself or your friends or colleagues will benefit from it, you could at any time have them give us a call or log on to our website as well. And also, ladies and gentlemen, I also want to just urge you about the feedback form, which is available in the polling area right now, which has just got over 8 questions, and they're all multiple choice in nature, so it shouldn't take you a minute or two. So if before you leave, please do go ahead and share your feedback with us. This is again just to ensure that we could only improve our webinars for the future, and also to give retrospect on how today's webinar session did go. So it would definitely help the Global Compliance Panel team and John as well. So if John, I don't see any questions on the screen, so I'll just give it an extra 30 seconds to see if we do have any questions here.
Okay, and in the meantime, I'd just like to reiterate not only definitions regarding what we talked about in terms of the design history file, technical file, dossier, design dossier, but also definitions regarding verification, validation, qualification, etc. IQ, OQ, PQ, if you're using that, if you're under ASTM E2500 where you don't use those terms, you obviously have to do the same kind of activities anyway, so whatever terms you use, make sure they're covering all the bases, that you optimize your parameters, and that you then prove the repeatability and reproducibility of your system by means of repeated testing, challenging all the worst case inputs. And I usually control inputs by means of flow charting and Ishikawa / cause and effect diagrams, fishbone diagrams, to make sure I covered all the inputs that allow me to factor or focus in on the key metrics, if you will, as we mentioned earlier, that being a problem sometimes in some documentation.
Thank you, John. John, in fact, I have a question here. I'll just read that out to you. The question is, can FDA disputes with your worst case scenario of PQ?
Oh, no question about it. You bet they can. But the point is, one thing I like to stress in some of my webinars is, if you anticipate an area of disagreement, make sure you've thought it through and you cover it by means of documentation of your rationale. I usually include that in either the validation documentation or an SOP. An example being that N = 30 sample size. Include a good rationale as to why you did the thing you did. Then what the FDA does, they may disagree with you, they may vehemently disagree with you, but they can't argue with the fact that you've looked at that issue, you've considered it, and you came up with a decision. They are less likely to push the issue if your decision has a good rationale behind it and it was thought through before the audit. If it's in something that you can pull out and show them. If you're shooting from the hip during an audit, forget it. But if you have it thought through, they may disagree. Now what happens, and I've been through this route myself, is the local post auditor may disagree, and they'll take it back to their supervisor, and the supervisor, let's say, upholds their decision. So they write up a 483. You can have one of two choices. You may feel it's not worth the effort to disagree with them, even though you do disagree, and you'll agree to make the changes that they require to put it to bed once and for all. Or you may feel, no, this is too costly for us. We feel we've addressed the issue. We feel we've got the data to support that. We feel we're on solid ground, so we professionally disagree, and explain why. We recognize your point, but we disagree with it. Here's what we've done. We feel this meets the issues. Here's the risk involved. And then the district office now will review that. In some cases, the district office will uphold you as opposed to their auditor. On the second, and more than likely, though, they'll go along with the auditor. Now you have a choice to make. You can either at this point fold your cards and basically say, no, I'm going to go ahead and I'll make the changes you request. We feel we have met those requirements, but we'll go ahead and do what you've asked. Or You say, no, this is still too costly. It is not justified by the risk and or the other methods we have in place to address that issue, and you can kick it all the way up to the center. In our case, it would be CDRH. In several cases, I have seen that the center will uphold the company if you've got a good rationale and it was done before the audit. They see you thought it through, you've got a good argument, it's all printed out there, it's available, and then they will uphold you. And basically, and if you've done it professionally, all parties involved aren't hurt by it, and they uphold that, providing you haven't, gotten nasty about it. So that being the case, yes, if you feel strongly about a matter and you've got a good case, you've thought it before, you've got the documentation on hand, and you feel it is a costly change to make an issue about, to bow down to, then go ahead, by all means, professionally disagree and take it as far as you want to take it, recognizing you can win. The centers generally take a more strategic 30,000-foot view of things than the local posts and the districts do. And sometimes what the centers want doesn't always reach the auditor until years later, too. And I've heard this. I've been on some grassroots meetings where that's actually been brought out by center personnel. But that's a problem they sometimes have. If you read the 510K report from August 2010, you will find that even within the agency, it's just like any company. People have different definitions for different things, and management may not know what their staff people are doing or disagree with the way the staff does it and vice versa. And various departments may disagree with other departments. The FDA is no different from any company in terms of human interaction. So if you have a strong case, well thought out, with scientific data behind it, don't be afraid to disagree professionally with the agency. You may win. Good question.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any final questions, you could go ahead with them. We have 10 more seconds. So if you have one last question for the moment, you could post them on the screen, or you could also send me a chat message. Or if you come up with questions, like I said, later, you could at any time have them emailed as well. And on the screen, ladies and gentlemen, we have a webinar which is coming up in about a week's time of John himself. So if you are interested in the topic, you could at any time, once again, give us a call or log on to our website. And we also have a dedicated web page for John Lincoln as well. So if you're interested, it's on your screen and in the handouts which you received as well. And you could just log on to our website, go to the page, and you can come with all topics related to John, the present and the past webinars as well. So you could at any time go through them as well. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't see any questions on screen. John, let me just check. I don't see any questions coming up, John, so we'll go ahead and conclude the session. Before we do, any final remarks of today's audience?
Well, again, I apologize for any inconvenience caused by my bronchitis a few weeks ago, but I appreciate you hanging in there. Hopefully this met your requirements. If not, please address any shortfalls by means of Q&A, as Michael mentioned, and I certainly will respond. I find those very valuable to myself and my presentation, and hopefully they are of value to you as a little bit extra for signing up for this webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, like John just said, so if you have any questions or suggestions, you could at any time write into us or give us a call as well. The numbers and the websites are on screen. And also, once again, would really appreciate if you could just share your feedback on today's session. It will just take about a minute or two. The feedback is open in the polling area, so please do go ahead and share your feedback before you do log out. And once again, I appreciate all of you logging in for today's session. Thank you all for participating. And on behalf of John E. Lincoln and the entire Global Compliance Panel team, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.